The winter of 1831 settled over Fort Union with the kind of cold that made a man feel as though even his bones had turned against him. Charles Larpenteur wrote in his journals that some winters crept in like a thief and stole the warmth right out of your chest. And this was one of them. The Missouri lay locked beneath plates of ice, the river groaning at night like some wounded animal. The chimneys of the fort spat thin ropes of smoke into a sky the color of lead. Frozen beaver hides, stiff as boards, lay stacked against the palisade walls, and every time a trappeur stomped across the yard, his moccasins rasped against snow, beaten hard by wind and human misery. Elias Boone Hardesty, half Scots-Irish, half Métis, pulled his worn buffalo robe tighter around his shoulders as he walked along the north bastion. He had returned to the fort only 2 weeks earlier, after guiding a wagon party down from the Milk River country, and still carried in his hair the smell of spruce smoke and frozen pine. Elias had grown up between worlds, raised in a Métis camp on the Red River, schooled by a Scots father who had died young, and mentored by Crow hunters who taught him how the land breathed and how to listen for signs others missed. He spoke Crow like a man born to it, and enough Shoshone to hold a conversation. Among the fort's population of French engagés, Yanktonai visitors, Gros Ventre traders, and ragged Americans, he blended easily into whichever group needed talking to. But on that morning, as he shoveled snow away from the door of the trade house, a shout rang across the frozen yard. "Rider comin' in! Looks bad!" 2 men dragged open the main gate as a horse lurched through, steam pouring off its flanks. Its rider slumped forward, arms hanging like wet rope. Elias recognized him before the man even hit the ground. Samuel Drouillard. The old trapper had been on and off in the mountains since the days when Jedediah Smith first cut trails through the far southwest. Deep lines carved his face. The left side of his beard still bore a patch where a Comanche lance had grazed him years earlier. He was tough, wiry, filled with the kind of iron frontier men didn't forge anymore. But now his leg hung at an unnatural angle, and blood soaked the buckskin of his coat. They carried him into the trade house, where the air smelled of cold coffee, wet fur, and tallow smoke. Elias knelt beside him as the factor barked at a clerk to fetch water. Drouillard's breath rattled low, a shallow tremor like wind blowing through hollow reeds. His eyes fluttered open at the sound of Elias's voice. "You damn fool," Elias murmured. "What hole did you ride yourself into?" "Horse went down." "Ice hidden under powder," Drouillard whispered. "Didn't have the sense God gave a turnip." They tried to ease him back, but he clutched Elias's coat with surprising strength. "Got something," he gasped. "For you." Elias frowned. "For me?" Drouillard coughed, a wet sound that brought flecks of blood to the corner of his mouth. With his free hand, he fumbled inside his coat, fingers trembling. From within an inner pocket he pulled a folded scrap of vellum, stiff, yellowed, edges burnt and curling inward. The thing looked older than the fort itself. He forced it into Elias's hand. "Keep it. Safe." Elias opened it slowly. An oil stain spread across one corner. The ink, faded almost to sepia, formed rivers, ridges, and symbols drawn with the tightening precision of an educated hand. But it was the markings in the margins that stopped him, cold-flowing Spanish script, prayer-like notations, and the unmistakable signature of a cartographer trained in the old colonial schools. Drouillard spoke again, barely audible. "Spanish, Jesuit entrada, 1760s or thereabout. Man who drew it died bad. Found it with some Ute trinkets near the San Juan. Been carrying it for years, waitin' for someone who might read it true." The factor snorted. "Every greenhorn gets handed a lost mine map at least once. Usually comes with a fairy tale about gold shining out of a snake's mouth." A ripple of laughter circled the room, the kind of humor men used to keep death at a comfortable distance. But Elias didn't laugh. His eyes had snagged on one particular line drawn across the vellum, a winding cut through a cluster of red-inked peaks. The shape was unmistakable. He had seen it before, not on any map, but in the painted hides of the Crow and in the stories told to him by an old Shoshone man who once wintered with his family. the breathing mountain. The place where the cliffs bleed yellow iron, the fire that sleeps beneath the stone, stories that many called myths, but stories that held kernels of truth. And here, on a scrap of vellum older than any American presence in the Rockies, the landmarks matched with uncanny precision. "Where'd you get this?" Elias asked softly. Drouillard's eyes focused with sudden clarity. "From a dying Spaniard, or what was left of him. Found his bones in a ravine in the southern country. Thought it was fool luck. Might still be. But the thing haunted me." His breath hitched. "Not treasure. Not gold. It's older than that. And some places shouldn't be dug." The old man sagged, his grip faltered. Elias squeezed his hand, but he knew the feeling of a spirit retreating from the world. Drouillard exhaled once, a long and hollow sigh, and then his chest stilled. Someone crossed himself. Another muttered that the mountain men were dropping like flies this winter. Elias didn't move for a long moment. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters. Inside, the laughter about fairy tale maps drifted on, careless as snow. One man suggested tossing the vellum into the fire so it wouldn't curse the fort. Another joked about finding a lost silver kingdom guarded by beavers. Elias folded the map with slow, deliberate care. He did not believe in fairy tales, but he believed in patterns, in stories that repeated across nations, in half-remembered legends whose roots lay in something real, something older than the United States, older even than the fur trade. He rose, slipping the map inside his shirt. The others returned to their drinking, dice-playing, and hide-sorting. No one noticed the look on Elias's face, that sharp, thoughtful stillness he inherited from his Métis uncles when they caught sight of animal tracks half hidden beneath snow. Later that night, long after the trappers had retired and the fort fell silent except for the crackle of the guardhouse fire, Elias sat alone beside the hearth. He spread the vellum across his knees. The flames painted the map in wavering gold and shadow. Drouillard hadn't known it, but Elias had spent long stretches studying Jedediah Smith's old travel notes, the routes across the Wind River Range, the hidden passes, the peculiar rock formations Smith sketched with almost obsessive precision. And now Elias saw it. The trails on the vellum matched those recorded by Smith in 1826. His breath tightened. The map was not a myth. It was a door, and someone had died carrying the key. The thaw never came that winter. By early February, the snow had crusted so hard that a horse could walk atop it without breaking through. Fort Union lay half-entombed, its walls rising from drifts like the ribs of some ancient bison left to bleach in the cold. Yet word traveled beneath the ice the way it always did on the frontier, quietly, sideways, carried by men who pretended not to hear but missed nothing. By the third day after Samuel Drouillard's death, rumors were already circling. The old man gave Hardesty something. Looked like a map. Probably another fool's tale about Spanish gold. Some joked Elias would be rich by spring. Others said the Spaniards had cursed anyone who followed them. But none of that mattered. What mattered was what Elias saw when the firelight touched that vellum, a shape long buried in memory. 2 weeks into February, a small band of wintering Crow arrived from the Musselshell country, drawn north by the promise of trade. Elias recognized most of them older men with deep-set faces and quiet eyes, hunters whose knowledge of the Yellowstone Basin rivaled anything found in American journals. Among them was Little Elk, who had once shared a lodge with Elias's Métis uncle during the terrible winter of 1825. The sight of the elder stirred old respect. Elias waited until evening to approach him. The trade house glowed with lamplight, and the smell of boiling pemmican drifted through the doorways. Little Elk sat near the fire, sharpening a bone awl. When Elias greeted him in Crow, the old man's expression softened. "You carry questions," Little Elk said, barely glancing up. Elias hesitated, then slipped the folded vellum from his coat. "I do." The old man's eyes narrowed when he saw the burnished edge of the parchment. He took it in both hands, turning it slowly. His fingertips traced the red-inked peaks. His lips pressed together. "Who drew this?" he asked. "A Spaniard," Elias answered. "Long before our time." Little Elk's brow furrowed. "These marks." He tapped a cluster of symbols near the center, spirals, triangles, a jagged line drawn like a lightning bolt. These are not Spanish. No. Elias leaned forward. I think the man who made it learned from the people who walked that country before any of us. Little Elk studied the parchment for a long moment. The fire popped, snow hissed against the lodge hide. Finally, with slow gravity, he pointed at a place halfway up the vellum. This, he said, is the Sun Spine Range, where the ridges run like the back of a great elk. His finger moved slightly right, and here the red scree, bowl, a bad place. Stones fall like angry spirits. Then he tapped the lightning mark. And this is where the mountain breathes. A faint chill crawled up Elias's arms. He had heard the phrase, as a boy. A Shoshone elder once told him of a canyon where warm wind escaped from cracks in the earth, carrying the smell of fire. Some said it was a sleeping beast. Others claimed it was the breath of the world itself, rising from a deep place no man should disturb. Elias asked softly, "Is it real?" Little Elk nodded. "Real and dangerous. Our fathers warned us not to enter. A man who hunts there may not return." He folded the map and handed it back, his expression grave. The Spaniards came north many generations ago. Some dug holes in the red cliffs. They angered the mountains. The earth swallowed them. Elias felt something tighten in his chest. Could they have been mining? The Crow elder gave a small shrug. They took yellow iron, hard stone that shone like sunlight. Worthless for arrows, but your people think different. Gold. The word didn't need saying. Elias left the lodge with the map tucked beneath his coat, frost gathering on his beard. The moon hung low over the fort, turning the snow into a pale sheet of bone. As he walked the outer palisade, his thoughts churned. The Crow elder's landmarks matched the vellum perfectly. The trails resembled Jedediah Smith's notes from 1826, and the breathing mountain lines corresponded to volcanic vents known only to tribes who lived there for centuries. The next morning he sought out Etienne Robideau, a French cartographer's assistant stranded at Fort Union while waiting for spring brigades. Etienne's knowledge of Spanish script was limited but sufficient. He studied the map by lamplight, brow furrowing. "This is old," he muttered, "older than most maps in the territory. The handwriting, Castilian, I think, but wrong for a soldier, more like a Jesuit-trained hand." Elias felt the pieces locking together. A Jesuit entrada, 17th century, red cliffs, breathing mountains, Spanish extraction marks, and an old trapper who gave up his dying breath to pass the vellum on. "Do you think it's real?" Elias asked quietly. Etienne tapped the inked ridges. "Real enough." But whoever drew it wanted someone to find something specific. This mark, he pointed at a symbol shaped like a small sun, is not Spanish. It's native. Maybe Crow, maybe Shoshone. They helped guide the Spaniards, I think. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the shutters. Elias stared at the map, jaw tightening. The thing felt heavier in his hand than it had before, as though it carried not just ink, but memory, warning, and possibility. The fort's men could laugh all they wished. He knew better. Stories that survived this long usually did so for a reason. That night, after the fort settled into uneasy sleep, Elias sat alone beside the hearth again. The flames cast long shadows across the floorboards, and the fire hissed occasionally as sap pockets burst in the burning logs. He unfolded the map, followed the river. Cut east at the Elkback Ridge, climbed to where the mountain breathes. The signs lined up too perfectly to dismiss. Drouillard had not wasted his last strength on a fool's errand. Elias's pulse steadied, his breath deepened, and a decision settled over him like falling snow. In the spring, when the river thawed and the passes loosened, he would follow the map. He would find the breathing mountain, and he would learn what the Spaniards had died trying to keep buried. By mid-March, the sky above Fort Union finally began to soften, losing the hard metallic gleam it had worn all winter. The Missouri groaned beneath its shell of ice, cracks spreading like veins through blue glass. Ravens returned to the cottonwoods. The trappers grew restless, sharpening knives, rewrapping snowshoes, checking powder, Horns. Life at the fort was stirring, the land was waking, and with it came the pull every mountain man felt when the season turned a call to move. Elias Boone Hardesty answered it. He spent the last weeks of winter planning in silence, assembling a small outfit. He did not want fortune hunters or loudmouths, and he wanted no man who believed the map promised easy gold. He needed travelers, not dreamers. Men who understood the land's moods and dangers, who treated the mountains as living things rather than obstacles. The first he approached was Etienne Robideau, the French cartographer's assistant, whose sharp eye had recognized the Jesuit hand on the vellum. Etienne had wintered in the fort's cramped loft space, drawing maps he hoped to sell to the American Fur Company come spring. Elias found him at dawn, hunched over a board, sketching river forks with a piece of charcoal. "You'll want more than ink and dust this spring," Elias said. Etienne looked up, studying Elias's face. "This is about the map we—" "It is." Etienne blew the charcoal powder from his fingers. "You think it leads somewhere real?" Elias nodded. Crow elders confirmed the landmarks. Something was there once, Spanish and older. "I need someone who can read what's left of the script." Etienne hesitated only a heartbeat. Life at the fort offered little small wages, smaller rooms, and winter sickness. The chance to map an undocumented region, perhaps even a lost entrada, quickened his blood. "I will go." The second man Elias sought was Jonas McCafferty, a miner from the Kentucky drift pits. Jonas was built like a burl, with arms thick as axe handles and a face carved by years' underground deep creases, soot-stained lines even soap and snow couldn't scrub clean. He had come west after a dynamite blast collapsed a shaft, killing half his crew. Jonas survived by sheer luck and a crude ventilation contraption he had built from scrap boards and oiled hide. Most men at the fort treated him like a half-crazed tinkerer, but Elias saw something else, a man who understood the language of stone. He found Jonas repairing a stove behind the blacksmith shed, muttering curses at a warped pipe. "You ever been near the Wind River Range?" Elias asked. "Close enough to smell the sulfur," Jonas grunted. "Why?" "I need someone who knows bad rock from good, someone who can read a mine by the sound of the beams." Jonas squinted at him. "You go and dig in, Hardesty?" "Maybe." "That map the old man gave you? Folks been jawing about it." Elias didn't answer, and Jonas raised a brow, then spat into the snow. "I'll go," he said. "Not for treasure, but I'm tired of men thinking I'm a fool for knowing what rock wants." The last additions came not from the fort, but from a Shoshone camp 3 miles upriver, 2 brothers, Tosa and Nawi, lean as willow poles and quick as river trout. They had hunted elk with Elias 2 winters before and trusted his sense of judgment. When he showed them the vellum, they exchanged a long, quiet glance. "Those marks," Tosa murmured, tapping a small triangle drawn in the margin. "Our grandfather used that symbol. It warns of fire inside the earth." Nawi nodded. "We will guide you, but that place is not for fools. If the earth is angry, we leave." "Agreed," Elias said. By early April their small outfit was ready. The ice broke on the river in thunderous slabs, and the air filled with the smell of thawed mud and raw spring. The fort receded behind them, its palisades shrinking as they pushed westward along the old buffalo traces. They traveled with pack horses, light gear, and the careful rhythm of men who understood the wilderness. Days stretched long, nights crackled with cold. The land around them opened wide cottonwood bottoms, giving way to sagebrush flats, then to rolling ridges that shimmered under the sun like old, worn brass. It was on the 7th day that they found the first sign. Etienne spotted it. A shallow pit cut into a hillside, its wooden supports blackened with age. Jonas knelt beside the timbers, brushing away soil with reverent strokes. "Spanish," he muttered. "See how the beams angle inward? They built shafts like this down in the southern silver camps." Nawi crouched nearby. "Our people knew of strangers who dug in these places. Some said they brought sickness. Others said they angered the spirits of the mountain. Etienne cleared his throat. "Look at this." He held up a metal wedge, a rusted chisel, narrow and flared at the end. Elias felt his skin prickle. Objects could lie, but not like this. Tools didn't wander hundreds of miles on their own. They followed the map deeper into the Wind River foothills, and the land began to change. Red-stained cliffs jutted from the earth like old bones. The air warmed strangely, as if the mountains exhaled beneath the soil. Elias recognized the shapes, the elk-back ridges, the broken bowl of fallen scree, exactly as Little Elk had described. One evening, beyond a rise of red sandstone, Jonas froze mid-step. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. A low hum drifted from the cliffs, faint, rhythmic, like the breathing of some hidden thing. Elias exchanged a slow, uneasy look with Etienne. The map's markings had not lied. As the sun bled out across the horizon, turning the cliffs to fire, Elias understood the truth. They were close to whatever the Jesuit cartographer had found, close to whatever had killed him, close to the reason Samuel Drouillard had carried the map until his dying day. The lost Entrada was no myth, and the mountain ahead was waiting. The next morning dawned strange and quiet, as though the world were holding its breath. A pale mist clung to the valley floor, lifting in slow spirals that revealed glimpses of red cliffs and wind-scoured stone. Elias Boone Hardesty stood at the edge of a narrow ravine, the vellum map open in his hands, its brittle surface catching glints of early sunlight. Every mark, every inked ridge, every strange Spanish notation lined up perfectly with the land before him. "This is it," he murmured. Jonas McCafferty spat into the dust, then wiped his mouth with a soot-stained thumb. "Aye, place feels wrong, like a mine before it blows." Etienne Robideau shaded his eyes, staring at the cliffs. "Or like a place the earth has not finished making." The Shoshone brothers, Tosa and Nawe, stood silently, their faces tense. Tosa pointed toward a narrow crack in the ravine wall. "That is the place our grandfather spoke of," he said softly, "where the warm breath comes out, where birds do not build nests, where even snow shies away." Elias's pulse quickened. The stories had been the same in Crow lodges, Shoshone camps, and even in Beckworth's tales, a place where the mountain breathed, exhaling warm air like a living creature, a place the old ones warned against. He folded the map and slipped it into his coat. "Let's see what the Spaniards were after." They moved carefully down the ravine. With every step, the air grew warmer, smelling faintly of sulfur and deep earth. The temperature shift was so abrupt that their horses tossed their heads, snorting uneasily. The animals sensed what the men only suspected. Something beneath the rock was alive in its own way. The ground changed too. Frost gave way to damp clay, and patches of moss clung to the stone as though nourished by hidden steam. Jonas crouched, pressing his palm against the earth. "Warm," he muttered. "Ain't natural for this season." They rounded a bend and stopped. Before them yawned the collapsed entrance of a mine. It was unmistakably human-made, a dark wound carved into the cliffside, framed by rotten timbers blackened with soot. A stone lintel lay half-buried in scree, engraved faintly with a sunburst symbol, surrounded by Spanish lettering. The left side of the entrance had caved inward, forming a massive heap of rubble that choked the tunnel's mouth. Naui made a low sound in his throat. "Bad place. The rock fights itself." Etienne knelt by the lintel, brushing dust away with careful strokes. "This carving, it's Jesuit. The cross design, the sunburst, it's their style." Elias traced the faded symbol with a gloved finger. "It matches the mark on the vellum." Tosa stepped forward, holding a small bundle of dried sweetgrass. He lit it with his flint and blew gently, releasing a thin ribbon of smoke that drifted into the collapsed shaft. "If the smoke comes back," he said softly, "the spirits inside are angry." The smoke floated inward, hovered, then vanished into the darkness. Jonas huffed. "Spirits or no, there's something in there. And if the air's moving like that, it means the tunnel's not fully dead. There's space behind the collapse." Elias nodded. "We clear only enough to see inside. No heroics." They set to work. Jonas directed them like a mine captain, teaching the others how to move stones without triggering a second collapse. Elias hauled rocks, Etienne cleared debris, and the brothers pried loose the timbers with elkhorn tools. Hours passed, sunlight shifted. The warm breath of the mountain pulsed faintly against their faces. Finally, they cleared a narrow gap barely enough for a man to slip through. Jonas leaned close, inhaling. "Air's stale, real stale. That's what killed them." "Killed who?" Etienne whispered. "The Spaniards. You smell that?" Jonas tapped the side of his nose. "Bad gas, dead air." They dug too deep into a pocket, tried to blast their way through, didn't know how to clear it. Elias lowered himself to his knees and peered inside. A tunnel stretched beyond the collapse, its walls streaked with yellowish mineral veins. Broken tools lay half-buried in dust. Black scorch marks fanned across the ceiling like the fingerprints of an explosion. The old stories were true. "This wasn't a natural cave-in," Elias said. "Something blew." Jonas nodded grimly. "A dust or gas ignition. Same thing I seen back in Kentucky. They didn't know the rock. They didn't know how to breathe it." A faint tremor rolled beneath their feet, not enough to knock stones loose, just enough to remind them the mountain was not entirely asleep. Naui stepped back. "This place remembers death." But Elias had already made up his mind. "We go in." Etienne swallowed. "All of us?" "Not at once," Elias said. "Jonas and I first. You three stay by the opening. If the mountain turns on us, get back fast." Jonas grinned without humor. "Hell of a way to spend a spring morning." They tied ropes around their waists, exchanged a silent nod, and squeezed through the narrow opening. Darkness swallowed them instantly. The air felt thick, warm, and weighted with centuries. Jonas held a tallow candle up, and the tiny flame quivered violently. Inside the tunnel, the walls told the story no journal had captured: burn marks, blood streaks, a broken rosary, a rusted pick embedded in stone as though abandoned mid-swing. 100 feet in, they reached a chamber partially collapsed on one side. Bones lay scattered near the far wall, ribs crushed beneath fallen stone, skulls cracked by impact. Etienne's voice echoed faintly from the entrance. "Do you see anything valuable?" Jonas whispered instead of answering. They were work in a vein. He ran his fingers over a glimmering seam, small but rich. Elias wasn't looking at the ore. He was looking at a blackened section of ceiling circular, radiating outward, the blast site. He exhaled slowly. "Jonas, they died from the mountain's breath." Jonas nodded. "Same as half the pits back home. Same damn lesson they never learned." When Elias turned toward the entrance, the candlelight caught something on the far wall, a faint Spanish inscription scratched into stone. He stepped closer, brushing soot away. "Aquí terminó la fe." Here faith ended. A cold shiver crawled up his spine. He understood now. This mine had swallowed an entire entrada, and the Jesuit cartographer had drawn the map not as a treasure guide, but as a warning. Elias touched the inscription once more, then turned back toward the living world. Whatever lay deeper in the mountain, they had only begun to uncover the truth. Elias Boone Hardesty and Jonas McCafferty emerged from the mine mouth, blinking against the sunlight, faces streaked with soot, clothes powdered with ancient dust. Etienne, Tosa, and Naui moved toward them the moment they reappeared. "What did you see?" Etienne asked, voice low. Elias didn't answer immediately. He looked back at the collapsed entrance, at the blackened timbers, at the faint pulse of warm air rising from the gap like the exhalation of something sleeping uneasily beneath the stone. "We saw the place where the Spaniards died," Elias said quietly, "where a man's faith ended." Jonas tossed a stone behind him and wiped sweat from his neck. And the reasons plain as daylight. They suffocated themselves, dug right into a pocket o' dead air. Gas builds, dust settles, one spark boom. Etienne frowned. But they were not fools. They were miners. "Miners," Jonas said, "who didn't know the mountain." He knelt and traced a finger through the fine dust near the ravine floor. The texture was soft, almost flour-like. "This dust is just like the pits back east. Coal seams, shale pockets, even dry silver tunnels, they all hold breath you can't see. That's what kills men. Not demons, not curses, bad air. Tosa folded his arms. Our grandfather said the mountain was alive. Jonas gave a small snort. Aye, alive and angry if you don't treat it right, but the anger's natural, not mystical. Elias stepped closer. So, how do we go deeper without ending up like them? Jonas hesitated. His jaw flexed, and he looked almost embarrassed. There's a trick I used back home. Works sometimes. Saved more than a few men. Noe raised a brow. A trick? Jonas took a deep breath. Look, I ain't no scientist. Folks back in Kentucky called it McCafferty's folly, or that stupid hillbilly vent trick. But it works. Elias's eyes narrowed with interest. Show us. They spent the next hour gathering materials. Straight willow branches, strips of oiled buffalo hide, lengths of sinew, and whatever broken timber they could salvage from the mine's collapsed entrance. Jonas directed them with brisk, clipped efficiency, the confidence of a man who had lived more hours underground than most men lived in open sun. First thing you learn, Jonas said, is that bad air sinks where it ain't supposed to, and good air don't know how to move unless you give it a path. So you make one. He set to work lashing willow branches into a long, narrow frame. Tosa and Noe watched carefully, impressed by the miner's practiced hands. Etienne hovered nearby, scribbling rough sketches and notes in his ledger. Jonas stretched the oiled hide tightly across the frame until it formed a crude, flexible tube roughly the length of a man and wide enough to draw air. It looked like some strange cross between a drum and a canoe. Etienne blinked. This is a vent? Aye, Jonas said. Not fancy, but it breathes. He positioned it so one end rested just outside the mine's opening, angled upward toward the wind. The other end he slid into the narrow passage they had cleared earlier. Noe frowned. How does hide make wind? It don't. Jonas grinned. But the sun does. Air warms here. He tapped the outer end and rises. That pulls cooler air from the tunnel through the tube. It's slow, but steady, enough to clear pockets and let us breathe without dropping dead. Tosa crouched beside the contraption, fascinated. You made this as a boy? Made the first one after my pa nearly died in a drift shaft. Jonas shrugged. Foreman called me stupid, said real miners used bellows, pumps, or prayer. But when the blast went wrong, it was my stupid trick kept the rest of 'em alive. Elias smiled faintly. Then I trust your stupidity. Jonas barked a laugh. Glad someone does. To test the airflow, Jonas lit a strip of tallow-soaked cloth and held it near the outer mouth of the vent. The smoke was drawn inward, pulled through the hide tube and into the tunnel beyond. Tosa's eyes widened. The mountain breathes differently now. It breathes safer, Jonas corrected. They waited another hour for the vent to move, enough air to make the tunnel inhabitable. During that time, the men rested, sharpened tools, and prepared extra candles. Elias sat with the vellum map across his lap, studying the symbols again. The sunburst, the marks along the ridges, the small spiral near the Spanish script. They were no longer vague curiosities. They were coordinates, warnings, echoes of something that had once been alive with noise, tools, and prayer. When Jonas declared the air good enough to keep us upright, they prepared to enter again. This time all 5 went in. The difference was immediate. The air no longer pressed against their chests with oppressive weight. The candles burned steadier, their flames no longer sputtering in protest. The tunnel inhaled and exhaled in a slow rhythm, guided now by their own handmade vent. As long as the sun stays on that hide, Jonas murmured, we'll get a breath. They moved slowly, deeper than before, stepping into sections of tunnel untouched by air for perhaps a century. The walls gleamed with mineral streaks, iron, sulfur, and veins of quartz flecked with yellow. Etienne knelt to examine a fragment of broken crucible. They were refining ore here, he whispered. Some of it quite rich. Noe found an abandoned iron bar wedged into the rock. Tosa uncovered a Spanish-style hammer, its handle long rotted away. Jonas inspected each artifact like a man reading a story written in metal and stone. Then, at the far edge of the chamber, Elias found something half buried beneath a fallen beam, a scorched leather satchel containing fragments of a journal, brittle, blackened pieces, but still legible in parts. Etienne held the fragments near the candlelight, lips moving as he deciphered the script. The earth shakes. The fumes. The brothers. May God forgive our pride. Elias closed his eyes for a moment. Spanish, Jesuit. Exactly as Drouillard said. Jonas ran a hand along the wall, stopping at a fissure that exhaled faint warmth. This ain't the main collapse. That's deeper. We're only seeing the edge of what killed him. Tosa's voice was quiet, reverent. They dug into the mountain's heart. Elias nodded, jaw tight. And it killed them for it. Jonas tapped the hide vent, still trailing behind them like a lifeline. Good thing, he said, that we ain't as stupid as they were. Elias couldn't help but smile. Or maybe, he said, we're just stupid in a better way. Whatever lay deeper in the mountain, they were ready for it now. Jonas's foolish trick had given them a breath the Spaniards never had. And the deeper they went, the clearer it became. The mountain had more stories to tell. The deeper they descended, the more the mountain felt less like stone and more like an ancient, slumbering thing coiled, warm, and listening. Their candles flickered, stretching thin shadows along the walls. The hide vent behind them whispered softly as it drew air inward, its rustling a reminder that every breath they took hinged on Jonas's folly. At 50 paces beyond the chamber where they'd found the journal fragments, the tunnel widened into a vaulted cavern. The ceiling soared high above them, black with soot and scarred by lines that radiated outward like the ribs of a great beast. Shattered timbers jutted from the walls at odd angles. The smell of sulfur thickened. Jonas crouched, running his fingers along the scattered black dust. This is blast residue, a big one. He lifted a handful of the dust and let it fall. Spanish black powder. They used too much, or used it in the wrong place. Etienne knelt beside a cracked crucible and one half-melted ingot mold. They were smelting ore right here, he whispered. Who refines inside the shaft? That is madness. Men desperate for more yield, Jonas muttered. Seen it before, foremen pushing too hard, priests praying for miracles instead of ventilation. Tosa pointed at a collapse on the cavern's left side, a steep pile of rock and shattered timber half swallowed by darkness. There are bones under that, he said quietly. Elias knelt and shifted a piece of stone. Beneath it, dull white glimmered ribs crushed flat, a skull split along the crown. His breath tightened. He whispered, They didn't run. They never had the chance. He stood, brushing dust from his hands. This was no accident. This was a catastrophe. Etienne held up another journal fragment, charred along the edges. The mountain shook, flames like the breath of hell. Brother Ignacio swallowed by the earth. Naui glanced toward the fissure vents. This place remembers. The heat still lives here. As if in answer, a faint tremor rippled beneath their feet, subtle, like the sigh of a restless sleeper. Dust drifted from the ceiling. Jonas stiffened. We don't stay long. This roof's as trustworthy as a drunk gambler. They pressed deeper along a narrow side tunnel, its walls shimmering with mineral veins. The yellow ore glinted in the candlelight, beautiful and deadly all at once. Jonas stopped suddenly and pointed. See that? Along the wall, a line of charges had been drilled, deep boreholes filled with residue. They were trying to force the seam open, Jonas murmured. All at once. My God. They set a whole gallery to blow without clearing the gas first. Elias imagined it. The underground humming with trapped air, the Spaniards lighting the fuse, the sudden flash, the mountain exhaling fire. A blast that tore through the shaft, extinguishing every candle, every prayer, every man. Not a curse, not a legend, a mistake. Pride killed them, Elias said softly. Etienne touched the carved Spanish inscription on the wall, a faint sunburst, cracked by the blast. Or hubris. Jesuits believed God guided their hands. He shook his head. But this place was older than their faith. Noe pressed his palm to the rock. The earth warned them. They did not listen. A gust of warm air pulsed through the tunnel, stronger this time. Jonas's head snapped up. Time's up. That vent's workin', but something shifted in the deep chamber. We push farther. This whole place comes down on us. Elias nodded. We've seen enough to know what happened. And what could happen again? But something tugged at him, a feeling, an instinct. He turned back toward the far wall. A narrow ledge ran along the stone, barely a foot wide, leading toward a higher alcove. Elias climbed it, ignoring Jonas's muttered curses, and lifted his candle. There, protected from the blast by a natural overhang, lay a final remnant. A leather-bound folio, warped, water-stained, but intact enough to reveal the edges of maps layered inside. Spanish script curled along the margins. A Jesuit seal marked the cover. Elias's breath caught. This is the master map. Etienne's face lit with astonishment. The cartographer's originals, untouched. Elias wrapped the folio carefully and tucked it beneath his coat. Below him, Jonas shifted nervously. Hardesty, Roof's talkin'. We gotta go. As if on cue, a low groan shivered through the cavern stone, grinding against stone. Dust drifted like snow. Elias slid down with the map, and the 5 men moved swiftly back toward the entrance, Jonas's vent tube trembling with each pulse of air. They squeezed through the narrow passage just as a muffled roar echoed behind them, not a full collapse, but a warning. The mountain was settling again. Once outside, Noe cast a final glance at the ravine. We take nothing more, he said. This place is finished. Elias held the folio against his chest, feeling its weight, not treasure, but truth. Agreed, he said quietly. The Spanish dug too deep for greed. We dig no deeper. They sealed the entrance with stones, marking it with Shoshone symbols for danger and silence. As they walked away, Elias felt the warm breath of the mountain fade behind him. But the truth they carried, written in soot, faith, and fire, was only beginning to reveal its cost. Spring reached the upper Missouri like a slow confession, first a softening of the river ice, then a trickle of muddy water snaking between the frozen slabs, and finally the long groan of winter releasing its grip on the land. By the time Elias Boone Hardesty and his small outfit rode back toward Fort Union, the plains shimmered with new grass, and the cottonwoods whispered in the warming wind. But the men who arrived were not the same ones who had left. They carried no sacks of gold, no glittering treasure, no tales of a legendary El Dorado. What they carried instead was heavier. A Spanish folio filled with maps that should not exist, a story buried for 70 years beneath red cliffs and scorched stone, and the knowledge of how greed and faith had once collided inside the heart of a mountain. Jonas McCafferty also carried something not in his hands, but in his reputation. Word at Fort Union traveled faster than the spring thaw. By the time they stepped through the gate, men gathered like flies to spilled sugar. Well, Hardesty? Did you dig up Spain's lost kingdom? Find any gold to share with us poor souls? Or did the mountains swallow you like the stories say? Elias said nothing. He simply nodded to the factor, unsaddled his horse, and stored his gear with quiet routine. Jonas, however, drew attention of a different kind. One of the blacksmith's assistants pointed at the hide vent strapped to Jonas's pack-horse. What in God's name is that contraption? A fool's trick? Someone laughed. McCafferty's famous tunnel kite. But Jonas didn't flinch this time. He looked at the men, the same types who once mocked him back in Kentucky, the same who believed mining was brute work, not knowledge. Call it what you want, he said, evenly. But it saved our hides. Spaniards died in that mine because they didn't have one. The laughter died quickly. When Elias spread the Spanish folio across the trade house table, the room changed again. Instead of mockery, silence settled over the men. The vellum sheets were older than the fort itself, crisp edges curled, ink browned by time. Across the pages ran careful lines depicting canyons, ridges, river forks, and symbols unfamiliar to everyone except the Shoshone brothers who had walked the ground with Elias. Etienne translated slowly, reverently. Entries of the Holy Expedition, 1768. Preparations for extraction, great fire beneath the earth. Seek the sunspine by the path of the elk back. Hands that had once mocked the expedition now hovered over the pages in awe. This is real, someone whispered. The Spaniards were here, before Lewis and Clark. Why didn't anyone know? Elias closed the folio gently, protecting the fragile edges. Because the Entrada died before it could return. Their journals burned, their cartographer died in a ravine. The map that survived did so by accident. Jonas folded his arms. And because some stories ain't meant to be found, some get buried on purpose. The Shoshone brothers stood near the doorway, observing without speaking. When the questions turned toward gold, Tosa finally stepped forward. "You think the yellow iron matters," he said calmly. "But that mountain swallowed men long before you came. We sealed it for a reason." Now we added, "Some places belong only to the earth." Elias nodded. "And we honored that." The factor scratched his beard. "So there's no treasure?" Elias met his eyes. "There was never treasure, only a cautionary tale carved in fire." Later that evening, as the fort settled and the men drifted to their bunks, Elias sat alone beside the river. The folio rested in his lap, the pages fluttering, softly in the breeze like whispers from another century. Jonas joined him, lowering himself to the ground with a grunt. "You think the company'll want that map enough to send folks poking around again?" "Maybe," Elias admitted. "But I'll tell 'em the truth. The mine isn't worth the cost. Not in gold, not in lives." Jonas chuckled. "Then they'll listen to me before they listen to you." Elias raised a brow. "Oh?" Jonas tapped his temple. "I'll tell 'em the air's bad. Tell 'em the rock's unstable. Tell 'em anyone who goes in without a proper vent will drop dead faster than a beaver in a leg hold." Elias laughed a warm, tired sound. "That might do it." Jonas's face softened. "Hardesty, back in Kentucky they mocked me for that vent trick, called it simple, stupid. But today, those men at the fort looked at it different." "They saw the truth," Elias said. "A simple thing can save a life." Jonas nodded slowly. "Might save more. I'll show the miners up in the Montana camps. Could keep a whole crew breathing," the river murmured in agreement. Tosa and Naui approached then, their silhouettes outlined by the moon. Tosa placed a hand on Elias's shoulder. "You listened," the Shoshone said. "Many do not. That is why the mountain let you leave." Elias bowed his head. "We took nothing from the earth that she did not give freely." Naui smiled faintly. "Then the story will not follow you with anger." They left quietly, returning to their camp beyond the fort lights. Elias looked down once more at the Spanish map, its ink cracked, its margins burned, its warning centuries old. It had been carried across deserts, into mountains, through death and across generations, only to survive long enough to be understood. Not as a treasure guide, not as a legend, but as a reminder. Some mountains breathe, some truths burn, and some stories survive because someone needs to hear them, even if it takes 70 years of silence to find the right listener. Elias closed the folio and whispered to the darkening sky. The map wasn't leading to gold, it was leading to understanding. And somewhere far behind them, the breathing mountain exhaled one last warm sigh into the night, satisfied to be left in peace.